Right now, as you are lying there in the dark, something quiet and invisible is happening in the world of money. Somewhere, a central bank committee is reviewing numbers that will not be announced for weeks. Somewhere, a shopkeeper is quietly adjusting the price on a shelf label, a fraction at a time, almost without noticing they are doing it. Somewhere, a currency is being exchanged for another currency in an amount that would take you and me several lifetimes to count by hand. And underneath all of these small, disconnected moments, threading through every one of them, is a single phenomenon that shapes almost every financial decision made on this planet, every single day. That phenomenon is inflation. And the reason behind it, the actual mechanism, not the simplified version we get in headlines, is one of the most misunderstood stories in all of economics. But we will get to that. And if you are here because inflation has been on your mind, the prices at the grocery store, the rent that seems to climb a little every year, the news headlines that never quite make sense, the vague sense that money does not stretch the way it used to, you are in the right place. Not because we are going to give you a list of things to do about it, but because once you actually understand what is happening and why, most of the anxiety just settles on its own. And sometimes that understanding is the thing that needed to happen first, before anything else. But let us start somewhere closer, right here, in the world you live in, at this moment. Let us begin with the sentence almost everyone uses to describe inflation, and let us gently take it apart, piece by piece. The sentence is usually something like, inflation means things are getting more expensive. That sentence is not wrong, exactly, but it describes the symptom, not the disease. It is a little like describing a fever by saying, my forehead feels warm. True. Useful even, as a first observation, but it tells you almost nothing about what is actually happening inside the body. So, let us go one layer deeper. Inflation is not really about prices rising. Inflation is about the value of money changing. Prices rising is simply what that change looks like from where you are standing, holding a shopping list, standing in front of a shelf. The deeper truth is this: every unit of currency you hold, every coin, every note, every number sitting quietly in a bank account represents a kind of claim on the goods and services that exist in the economy. It is a ticket, in a sense. And when the number of tickets in circulation increases faster than the number of goods and services those tickets can be exchanged for, each individual ticket becomes worth a little less. Prices do not rise because bread suddenly became more valuable overnight. Prices rise because the currency used to buy the bread became, in relative terms, a little less valuable. This distinction matters more than it might seem to, lying here in the dark, because if you believe inflation is about greedy grocery stores or greedy landlords deciding on a whim to charge more, you will spend your energy directing frustration at the wrong target. And if you believe inflation is simply a natural, uncontrollable weather pattern, something that happens to economies the way storms happen to coastlines, you will feel powerless in the face of something that is, in fact, deeply human-made, historically traceable, and at least in principle, understandable. Let us build a picture together. Imagine an economy as a room full of goods, loaves of bread, pairs of shoes, hours of a plumber's labor, seats on an airplane, haircuts, umbrellas, everything that can be bought and sold. And imagine a second separate pile, all the money in that economy, sitting in wallets, bank accounts, and cash registers. Now imagine that pile of money, through some mechanism we will explore properly in a moment, suddenly doubles in size, while the room full of goods stays exactly the same size it was before. What happens? The same number of loaves of bread now has twice as much money chasing it. Something has to give. And what gives, almost always, is the price. Not because the bread changed, because the money did. This is the water in the bathtub analogy, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it will make several confusing things suddenly click into place. Picture the economy as a bathtub. The goods and services in the economy, everything that can be bought, form the shape and size of the tub itself, and the money supply is the water filling it. If the water level rises faster than the tub itself is growing, that is, faster than the economy is producing new goods and services, the water has to rise somewhere. It rises as prices. If, on the other hand, the tub itself grows, new factories are built, new efficiencies are discovered, more workers enter the workforce, technology allows more to be produced with the same effort, then the same amount of water can rise less or not rise at all because there is simply more tub to fill. This is why some economies can expand their money supply steadily for decades and still experience only mild, manageable inflation. Their tub is growing too, roughly in step with the water. Now, a second analogy, and this one will help with something that comes up constantly in the news, but is rarely explained clearly. Interest rates. Central banks are often described as raising rates to fight inflation, and if you have ever wondered why raising the cost of borrowing money would do anything at all about prices at the supermarket, you are asking exactly the right question. Think of interest rates as the brakes on a car, the engine of an economy, the actual activity of people working, building, spending, investing has a natural tendency to accelerate or decelerate on its own. When people feel confident, they borrow more, spend more, invest more, and the engine speeds up. When money is cheap to borrow, that acceleration happens faster because businesses can take out loans to expand more easily, and individuals can borrow to buy homes, cars, and everything else with less hesitation. This increased borrowing and spending is, in effect, more money moving through the economy at a faster pace, chasing the same goods. Remember, the bathtub, more water. Same tub, or a tub growing more slowly than the water is rising. Interest rates are the brakes because raising them makes borrowing more expensive. When it costs more to take out a loan, businesses slow their expansion plans, individuals delay big purchases like homes or cars, and the overall pace of spending in the economy cools down. It does not shrink the tub. It slows down how fast new water is being poured in. This is why the effects of an interest rate change are never immediate. A car does not stop the instant you touch the brakes. There is a delay, a period where the vehicle is still moving forward at its old speed even as the brakes are being applied. Economists call this delay long and variable lags, and it is one of the most genuinely difficult parts of managing an economy. You are adjusting something today, hoping to see the effect 18 months from now, all while the road ahead is foggy and full of surprises no one predicted. There is a subtlety worth mentioning here, because it explains why the inflation you feel and the inflation reported on the news sometimes seem to disagree with each other. When statisticians measure inflation, they typically construct something called a basket of goods, a representative collection of the things an average household tends to buy: food, housing, transportation, healthcare, entertainment, and so on. They track how the total cost of that basket changes over time, and that percentage change becomes the official inflation figure you hear reported, often called the Consumer Price Index. But no single household actually buys exactly that basket. If you spend a larger share of your income on housing than the average household in the basket, and housing costs are rising faster than everything else, your personal experience of inflation will feel more severe than the official number suggests. If you spend very little on the specific items that happen to be rising fastest, the opposite is true. This gap between the official average and your own lived experience is real, well understood by economists. And one of the most common reasons people feel that the numbers don't match what I'm seeing at the store. Both things can be true at once. The average may genuinely be moderating, while your particular basket of expenses continues to feel painful. It is worth knowing, too, that societies have developed specific tools designed to soften exactly the kind of anxiety we are describing. By building an adjustment for inflation directly into certain kinds of payments, this is called indexation, and it appears in many forms. Pensions and government benefits in many countries are adjusted periodically to reflect changes in the cost of living. Some rental agreements include clauses tying rent increases to a published inflation figure, and some government bonds are specifically designed so that both the interest paid and the final amount returned to the investor rise automatically alongside inflation. None of these tools eliminate the underlying phenomenon we have been describing, but they represent a deliberate institutional acknowledgement that inflation's effects are real and specific, and that certain kinds of income and savings can be at least partially protected from its erosion through careful, explicit design built directly into the contract or the policy itself, rather than left to chance. There is also a distinction worth knowing between headline inflation and something called core inflation. Headline inflation includes everything in the basket, including categories like food and energy, which tend to be volatile, swinging up and down based on weather, geopolitics, and seasonal factors that have little to do with the underlying, longer-term trend in the economy. Core inflation strips these volatile categories out in an attempt to see the more persistent underlying trend more clearly. This is why you will sometimes hear a central banker say something that seems almost contradictory. Headline inflation rose, but core inflation remained stable. And it is not doublespeak. It is an attempt to separate short-term noise from the longer-term signal, the way you might ignore a single unusually hot day when trying to understand whether the climate itself is warming. Let us address, gently, why inflation makes so many people anxious, because the anxiety itself is worth understanding, not just the numbers behind it. Part of it is a loss of predictability. Human beings, broadly, like to know that a dollar, a franc, a euro saved today will still buy roughly the same thing next year, or at least something close to it. When that stops being reliably true, planning becomes harder. Retirement calculations shift. The value of a fixed salary quietly erodes, even if the number printed on the paycheck never changes at all. A phenomenon economists sometimes call money illusion, where people instinctively judge their financial well-being by the nominal number on the page, rather than by what that number can actually buy, which can make inflation feel confusing even to people who understand it perfectly well in the abstract. There is also something almost primal about watching the price of food and shelter rise. Specifically, these are not luxury purchases. They sit at the base of the pyramid of human needs. And when the base itself becomes less certain, the anxiety tends to be sharper than it would be for, say, the price of a television or a vacation, rising by the same percentage. This is not irrational. It reflects a real difference in how essential different categories of spending are to daily survival and stability. There is also a subtler kind of unease, worth naming clearly. The sense that inflation is something being done to you by forces entirely outside your control or understanding. And in a strange way, that feeling of not understanding is often the most corrosive part, more corrosive in many cases than the price increase itself. This is precisely the feeling we are going to spend the rest of tonight dissolving. Not by giving you control over the economy. Nobody has that, not even the people who run central banks, as we will see, but by giving you clarity about the mechanism underneath it. Clarity, it turns out, is its own kind of relief, even when it does not change a single number on a receipt. It is worth knowing, too, that when economists speak of the money supply as though it were a single simple number, they are actually referring to several overlapping measures, distinguished mainly by how easily the money in question can be spent. The narrowest measure, sometimes called M0, includes only physical cash and coins in circulation, along with the reserves banks hold directly with the central bank. A broader measure, M1, adds the money sitting in checking accounts, instantly accessible, effectively as good as cash for most everyday purposes. A still broader measure, M2, adds savings accounts and other funds that are slightly less immediately accessible, but still relatively liquid. Economists watch all of these measures because a rapid expansion concentrated in the broader categories can signal different things about where new spending power is accumulating than an expansion concentrated in the narrowest one. This layered structure of moneyness is part of why a simple phrase like "the government printed money" is almost always an oversimplification of a genuinely more complicated, layered process, most of which, as we will see shortly, happens through commercial bank lending rather than a literal printing press at all. It is also worth noticing that your personal experience of inflation shifts depending on your particular stage of life in ways that are entirely predictable once you see the underlying pattern. A young renter, spending a large share of income on housing and just beginning to build savings, experiences inflation very differently from a homeowner with a fixed-rate mortgage, whose largest monthly expense is effectively locked in place regardless of what happens to prices elsewhere. A retired person living on a fixed pension experiences it differently again, since their income may not adjust at all, while their spending remains tied closely to categories like healthcare, which can rise faster than the general basket of goods. None of these differences reflect a flaw in how inflation is measured. They simply reflect the reality that a single national average, however carefully constructed, is describing millions of genuinely different individual situations at once, each shaped by its own particular mix of income, assets, debts, and expenses. There are, broadly, a few different flavors of inflation, and distinguishing between them will make a great deal of confusing news coverage suddenly make sense. There is demand-pull inflation, which happens when the water spending, driven by an expanding money supply, cheap credit, or simple consumer confidence, rises faster than the tub, the economy's real capacity to produce goods and services. This is the classic too much money chasing too few goods situation we have already described. There is cost-push inflation, which happens not because there is suddenly more money chasing goods, but because the cost of producing those goods rises. The price of oil spikes. A key raw material becomes scarce. A supply chain is disrupted by weather or conflict or logistics failures, and businesses pass those higher costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices, even without any meaningful change in the underlying money supply at all. And there is a third, more psychological form, sometimes called built-in or expectations-driven inflation, where people simply begin to expect prices to keep rising, and that expectation becomes self-fulfilling. Workers ask for higher wages to keep pace with expected future prices. Businesses raise prices in anticipation of higher costs down the line, and the expectation itself becomes a real, active ingredient in the mechanism, rather than a passive prediction about it. This third type deserves a moment of real attention, because it is one of the strangest and most human aspects of the entire topic. Money, as we are going to explore properly very soon, only has value because we all collectively agree it does. And it turns out that our beliefs about the future of that value can actually help create that future. If enough people expect 5% inflation next year, businesses and workers behave in ways that tend to produce something close to 5% inflation, almost regardless of what the underlying economic fundamentals might otherwise suggest. This is why central bankers spend an enormous amount of energy not just managing money supply and interest rates directly, but managing expectations, communicating clearly, consistently, and predictably, precisely so that people believe prices will behave a certain way, because that belief itself becomes part of what makes prices behave that way. This self-reinforcing loop is sometimes called the wage price spiral. Rising prices lead workers to demand higher wages to keep up. Businesses facing higher wage costs raise prices further to cover them, and the cycle can continue, feeding on its own momentum until something, usually deliberate policy action, sometimes a change in circumstances, interrupts it. There is one more piece of vocabulary worth having in hand before we move into the history, because you will encounter it constantly in different disguises for the rest of your life. Whenever this topic comes up, economists distinguish between nominal values and real values. A nominal value is simply the number printed or displayed. Your salary? The price on a tag, the balance in an account. A real value adjusts that number for inflation, telling you what it can actually buy compared to some earlier point in time. If your salary rises by 3% in a year, but prices rise by 5% that same year, your nominal income has grown, but your real income, what that income can actually purchase, has quietly shrunk. This single distinction, nominal versus real, resolves an enormous amount of everyday confusion. It explains why a raise can sometimes feel like no raise at all. It explains why a fixed pension, unchanged in nominal terms for years, slowly buys less and less over time, even though the number on the statement never moves. There is also a subtler cost of inflation, one economists sometimes call menu costs and shoe leather costs, and both names are oddly literal. Menu costs refer to the real, tangible expense businesses face simply from having to update their prices, reprinting a restaurant menu, relabeling shelves, reprogramming a till system, a cost that seems trivial for a single business, but adds up meaningfully across an entire economy during periods of rapid inflation when prices need to be updated far more frequently than usual. Shoe leather costs refer to the time and effort people spend trying to minimize the amount of cash they hold, precisely because cash sitting idle is quietly losing value. More frequent trips to move money between accounts, more attention paid to timing purchases, more mental energy spent simply managing money that in a more stable environment would require none of that effort at all. Neither of these costs shows up as dramatically as a headline price increase, but together they represent a genuine, measurable drag on how efficiently an economy functions. One more reason economists generally prefer inflation to be low and predictable, rather than high or volatile. It is also worth being honest that inflation, at its most extreme, can accelerate into something categorically different, called hyperinflation, typically defined, somewhat arbitrarily, but usefully, as inflation exceeding 50% in a single month. Various countries across different decades have experienced this extreme version, where the ordinary mechanisms we have described stop behaving in a gradual, manageable way, and instead feed on themselves with tremendous speed. As trust in the currency collapses faster than institutions can respond, we will look closely at the most famous historical case of this shortly, because it teaches the entire mechanism of inflation more vividly and more memorably than almost any other single episode in economic history. So, to summarize what is actually happening right now, in your economy, whichever one you happen to live in, money is a claim on goods and services. When the number of those claims grows faster than the goods and services themselves, each claim is worth a little less, and this shows up as rising prices. This can happen because there is simply more money circulating relative to what is being produced, because the cost of producing things has genuinely risen, or because people have come to expect it will happen and are behaving in ways that help make it true. None of this is a moral failing on anyone's individual part, and none of it is entirely random or arbitrary. It follows patterns that have appeared in one form or another for roughly as long as human beings have used money at all, in civilizations that never had any contact with one another, separated by oceans and centuries. But to understand why money works this way, why this pattern keeps appearing across centuries and across continents, in ancient empires and modern democracies alike, we need to go back. Not because history is interesting for its own sake, though it very often is, but because the present, on its own, does not fully make sense without it. So, if money is just a shared story we all agree to believe, and it is, we will show you exactly why in a moment. How did that story begin? And how did it evolve into the system we live inside today? The one where a committee of economists in a single room can influence the price of your morning coffee months later, without ever touching a single loaf of bread or a single bag of coffee beans themselves. Let us start further back than most explanations bother to go, before money existed at all. In small, early human communities, exchange happened through barter, trading one good directly for another. I have extra grain, you have a spare goat, we trade. This works, in a small way, for a small number of participants, trading a small number of goods. But it has a fundamental flaw, one economists call the double coincidence of wants. For barter to work, I need to find someone who has exactly what I want and who simultaneously wants exactly what I have at exactly the same moment. If I have grain and want shoes, I need to find a shoemaker who happens to want grain. Right now, if the shoemaker instead wants fish, we are stuck unless we can find a longer chain of trades, grain for fish, fish for shoes, which becomes exponentially more complicated as an economy grows larger and its goods become more varied and specialized. This is the problem money was invented to solve, not once, but independently, over and over again, in different civilizations that had no contact with one another whatsoever. In parts of Africa and Asia, cowrie shells became money, durable, portable, difficult to counterfeit, and universally recognized within their trading networks. In parts of the Pacific, on the island of Yap, enormous carved stone discs, called rhinestones, served the same purpose. Their ownership tracked cumulatively even when the physical stone itself sometimes never moved at all from where it was quarried. An early, almost startling example of money functioning as pure shared record-keeping, separate entirely from the physical object representing it. In early Mesopotamia, grain and silver by weight served as units of account, recorded on clay tablets. Some of the earliest written records humans ever produced were in fact ledgers, tracking who owed what to whom, And early Mesopotamian records even show something resembling interest-bearing loans, with specific, calculated rates charged on grain lent from one household to another, thousands of years before anything resembling a modern bank existed. Salt was so valuable as an early form of money in parts of the ancient world that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid partly in salt, which is very likely where the word salary comes from. What all of these early forms of money share is that they solved the double coincidence of wants by acting as an intermediate good, something everyone was willing to accept, not necessarily because they personally wanted the shells, or the salt, or the silver for its own sake, but because they trusted that someone else, later, would also accept it in turn. This is the very first appearance of the idea that will run through everything we discuss tonight. Money works because of shared belief, not because of the physical properties of the object itself. Coins, when they emerged, first in the kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, around the 7th century before the Common Era, solved another problem: verifying quality and quantity quickly, without lengthy negotiation. A stamped, standardized coin made of a specific metal at a specific weight meant that two strangers could trade without needing to weigh and assay the metal each and every time. The stamp itself was an early form of institutional trust, a guarantee, backed by the authority of a ruler, that this piece of metal was genuinely what it claimed to be. This is worth pausing on. The very first coins already contained the seed of everything modern money would eventually become. Their value depended not purely on the metal itself, but on trust in the authority that issued and guaranteed it. Even before Rome perfected this trick at scale, individual rulers in the Greek world had already discovered versions of it. The tyrant Dionysius of Syracuse, in the 4th century before the Common Era, is said to have faced a debt he could not repay and solved it through a strikingly direct maneuver. He ordered all citizens to bring in their silver coins under threat of death for anyone who withheld them. Then, had those coins re-stamped with a face value of twice their original worth before returning them to their owners. In a single afternoon, by decree alone, Dionysius had effectively doubled the nominal money supply of his city without adding a single ounce of new silver to it. The predictable result, in the months that followed, was that merchants throughout Syracuse adjusted their prices upward to reflect the coin's true diminished value, leaving ordinary citizens no better off than before, despite technically holding twice as much money as they had the previous week. This is, in essence, the very same lesson Rome would relearn centuries later, and that China would relearn again with paper instead of metal, and that France would relearn once more with John Law. Changing the number stamped on a unit of currency does not change the real wealth underlying an economy, and prices, sooner or later, adjust to reflect that underlying reality, regardless of what any single ruler decrees. This is where debasement enters the story more fully, and it is one of history's earliest and most persistent lessons about inflation. Rulers across many civilizations discovered a very tempting trick. If you reduce the amount of precious metal in a coin while keeping its stamped face value the same, you can mint more coins from the same amount of metal, effectively creating new money out of thin air. The Roman Empire did this repeatedly over centuries, gradually reducing the silver content of the denarius, until, by the 3rd century of the Common Era, coins that had once been genuinely silver were barely silver-plated bronze, worth only a small fraction of their original metal content. The predictable result, again and again, was rising prices, because merchants, who were not fools, adjusted the prices they charged to reflect the true, diminished value of the coin in their hand, regardless of what number was stamped on its face. This is, in essence, the very first documented case of a government-driven expansion of the money supply, not by printing more paper since paper money did not yet exist in Rome, but by quietly making each coin worth less metal, which amounts to the same underlying mechanism: more nominal money chasing the same amount of real goods. Rome's response to the rising prices this caused offers its own quiet lesson, one that still echoes in policy debates today. In the year 301, the Emperor Diocletian, frustrated by continued price increases despite his attempts at currency reform, issued what historians now call the Edict on Maximum Prices, a sweeping decree fixing the maximum legal price for well over 1,000 different goods and services, from wheat to lion skins to a day's labor from a shepherd, with the threat of execution for anyone who charged more. The edict did not work. Rather than sell goods at a legally fixed price that no longer reflected their debased currency's true value, merchants simply withdrew goods from the market entirely, driving many products into black market trade at prices higher than before, or causing them to vanish from legitimate commerce altogether. Within a few years, the edict was quietly abandoned. This episode is worth carrying with you because it is the first clearly documented instance of a pattern that repeats itself many times across later history, attempting to fix the symptom of inflation, the prices themselves, through direct decree, without addressing the underlying cause. The actual relationship between money and goods tends not to solve the problem. It tends, instead, to simply move the problem somewhere less visible. There is another episode, centuries later, that shows the exact same mechanism operating on a genuinely continental scale without a single coin being debased by anyone at all. Beginning in the 16th century, Spanish galleons began carrying enormous quantities of silver back across the Atlantic from newly conquered territories in the Americas, particularly from an extraordinarily rich deposit at Potosi, in what is now Bolivia. Over the following century, the amount of silver circulating throughout Europe increased dramatically, flowing outward from Spain into trade with the rest of the continent. And precisely as our bathtub analogy would predict, prices across much of Europe rose substantially over this period, in an episode economic historians now call the price revolution. This is a genuinely important case to sit with because it demonstrates that the mechanism we described earlier has nothing to do with printing presses or paper or any deliberate decision by a government to debase a currency. It is simply about the relative quantity of money compared to the quantity of goods. An enormous, unplanned influx of real, physical, entirely legitimate silver had, functionally, the exact same effect on prices as a ruler deliberately debasing coins or a modern central bank printing new currency. The mechanism does not care where the extra money came from. It only cares that there was, suddenly, more of it, chasing the same amount of bread, wool, and wine. Let us move forward now, across many centuries, to a different civilization that arrived at a genuinely radical innovation on its own. Paper money itself, which first emerged not in Europe, but in China. During the Song dynasty, roughly 1,000 years ago, merchants, tired of carrying heavy strings of metal coins across long trade routes, began depositing coins with trusted merchants in exchange for lightweight paper receipts called jiaozi, which could later be redeemed for the original coins. The government eventually took over the issuance of these notes, recognizing an enormously convenient tool. And here, remarkably, the very same lesson from Roman coin, debasement, repeats itself almost exactly, just with paper instead of metal. Successive dynasties, facing military costs and administrative expenses, gradually printed more paper currency than the underlying reserves of coin and goods could support. Historical records describe periods of severe price inflation as a direct result along with attempts, some successful, some not, to restrict and reform the paper currency system. China's early experiment with paper money is, in many ways, the first full demonstration of the entire inflationary mechanism in its purest form. A promise, printed on paper, expanded faster than the real economy underneath it could bear. Let us bring the thread back to Europe, to a moment that changes everything there as well, the emergence of formal banking as we would begin to recognize it today. In Renaissance Florence, a family we cannot avoid mentioning tonight built one of the most influential financial institutions in history, the Medici. The Medici Bank, founded in the late 14th century, pioneered techniques still recognizable in modern banking: branch networks across different cities, letters of credit that allowed a merchant to deposit money in Florence and withdraw its equivalent in London or Bruges without physically transporting gold across dangerous roads, and double-entry bookkeeping, a method of recording transactions so precise and so reliable that it is still, in its essential form, how accounting works today in businesses all over the world. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it illustrates something important. The Medici did not simply store money. They created a system where a promise, a letter, a ledger entry could function as if it were the money itself. This is the conceptual leap that paper currency, centuries later, would formalize on a national scale. A promise to pay, if trusted widely enough, becomes functionally identical to the thing it promises to be. Before we reach that story, it is worth pausing on one more thread, because it explains something that still shapes financial systems today: the long, uneasy relationship between religious and moral tradition and the practice of charging interest. For much of the medieval period in Europe, the Catholic Church treated the lending of money at interest, called usury, as a serious moral offense, drawing on scriptural passages that condemned profiting from another person's need. This created a genuine, practical problem. Since trade, construction, and virtually every large undertaking of the period required capital that someone, somewhere, needed to be willing to lend, Jewish communities, often barred from other trades by law and operating under a different religious tradition, with different rules about lending within and outside the community, came to occupy a significant role in medieval European finance as a result, a historical fact that later, tragically, became twisted into ugly stereotypes that had nothing to do with the actual economic logic that had created the situation in the first place. Meanwhile, merchant bankers, including the Medici we are about to meet properly, developed increasingly creative financial instruments specifically designed to generate a return on lent money without technically being classified as interest under church law. Arrangements involving currency exchange, delayed payment, or shared risk in a venture that achieved much the same practical economic effect as a loan with interest while satisfying the letter, if not always the full spirit, of religious restriction. This entire episode is worth remembering because it shows that the mechanics of money and lending are never purely mathematical. They are shaped at every point in history by the moral, religious, and cultural framework of the society running them, even when that framework and the underlying economic reality end up in quiet, creative tension with one another. This detail is crucial for what comes next because it leads us to one of the most dramatic and instructive episodes in the entire history of money: the story of John Law and the Mississippi Bubble. In early 18th century France, John Law was a Scottish economist and, by most contemporary accounts, something of a gambler and a showman who convinced the French regent that France's economic troubles, crushing debt left over from the wars of Louis XIV, could be solved through a bold, radical innovation. A national bank that issued paper currency, backed not by gold sitting quietly in a vault, but by the promised future profits of a trading company holding a monopoly on commerce with French territories in North America, centered on the Mississippi River. For a period, it worked spectacularly. Law's bank issued paper notes. Confidence in the scheme and in the trading company behind it soared. Share prices in the company rose to extraordinary heights, driven by enthusiasm, speculation, and the simple fact that more and more paper currency was being issued specifically to fund the buying frenzy. Ordinary Parisians, aristocrats, and foreign investors alike rushed to buy shares, convinced that fortunes were being made effortlessly, almost overnight. And this is where the lesson of the entire episode crystallizes. The money supply, the actual physical paper notes in circulation, expanded dramatically, far faster than the real, underlying economic value of the trading company's actual prospects in the swamps and forests of the Mississippi Territory. The tub had not grown. The water had. When doubts finally emerged, as they always eventually do once enough people start asking whether the promise underlying the paper is actually real, the collapse was rapid and brutal. Share prices crashed. Paper money, no longer trusted to represent real value, was rushed to be exchanged for gold and silver, causing a run that the system could not sustain. The Mississippi bubble left France with such a lasting distrust of paper currency that the country was noticeably slower than some of its neighbors to adopt paper money again in the following decades. Remarkably, almost the exact same story was unfolding at almost the exact same time, just across the English Channel. The South Sea Company, granted a monopoly on British trade with South America, saw its share price rise to extraordinary heights in 1720, fueled by speculation, borrowed money, and public enthusiasm, in a pattern so similar to the Mississippi scheme that historians have long debated how much direct inspiration passed between the two episodes. When the South Sea bubble burst later that same year, it ruined investors across British society, reportedly including the scientist Isaac Newton himself, who lost a substantial sum and is said to have remarked afterward that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. Two of Europe's largest economies, entirely independently pursuing the same basic pattern. New paper claims issued far faster than the real, underlying value they represented, arrived at the same painful lesson within months of each other. This near-simultaneous collapse is one of the clearest illustrations in all of economic history that this pattern is not a quirk of any single culture, ruler, or scheme. It is something close to a natural consequence of how shared belief in money behaves once it is stretched too far, too quickly, regardless of which country or century it happens in. This is, in miniature, almost every ingredient of inflation and monetary collapse we will ever discuss. Rapid expansion of a money supply disconnected from real productive capacity. Self-reinforcing expectations driving prices upward, and a sudden, painful reckoning when the shared belief underlying the whole system finally cracks. What is remarkable is that this pattern, rapid monetary expansion, disconnected from real economic growth, followed by a painful correction, repeats itself with almost eerie consistency across different centuries and different countries. In the early 1920s, the German Weimar Republic, burdened by reparations payments following the First World War, financed much of its government spending by printing money, leading to one of history's most extreme hyperinflations. Prices at one point doubled every few days. Workers were famously paid in wheelbarrows of near worthless currency, and people reportedly found it cheaper to burn banknotes for warmth than to spend them buying actual firewood. The lesson history draws from Weimar is not simply printing money is dangerous, though that is part of it, but something more specific. Once a population loses trust in a currency's future value, that loss of trust itself accelerates the collapse because everyone rushes to spend money the instant they receive it, further increasing the velocity, the speed at which money moves through the economy, which itself adds further upward pressure on prices in a vicious cycle that becomes extraordinarily difficult to break once it has properly begun. What is less commonly told, but arguably just as instructive, is how Germany eventually escaped this spiral. In late 1923, the government introduced an entirely new currency, the Rentenmark, deliberately limited in quantity and backed somewhat symbolically by a mortgage on the nation's agricultural and industrial land rather than by gold, which the country no longer had in sufficient reserve. The new currency's most important feature was not really its backing, but the sheer deliberate scarcity of it, combined with a credible public commitment from the new central bank not to repeat the excesses of the printing presses. Trust, which had been destroyed with startling speed, was rebuilt also with startling speed. Once the underlying mechanism, the relationship between the quantity of currency and the real economy behind it, was visibly and credibly restored. This is one of the more hopeful threads running through this entire history. However severe the collapse in trust, restoring a credible, disciplined relationship between money and goods tends to restore confidence far more quickly than the years of damage might suggest. Later episodes of extreme hyperinflation in other countries, in more recent decades, on different continents, entirely unrelated to Weimar, have followed remarkably similar arcs. Rapid collapse, followed by a deliberate currency reform, followed by a slow, often painful rebuilding of trust, a pattern that appears to transcend any particular country, culture, or era. Let us bring the thread forward to the birth of the institutions we live alongside today, central banks. Central banks, in their modern form, emerged largely as a response to a very specific and recurring problem: banking panics. In a financial system with many individual banks, each holding only a fraction of their depositors' money in reserve at any given time, a system called fractional reserve banking, which we will unpack more fully in the next beat. A rumor that a bank might be in trouble could cause depositors to rush to withdraw their funds all at once. Because the bank did not actually hold all deposits in cash, this rush, called a bank run, could cause an otherwise perfectly healthy bank to collapse simply because everyone tried to withdraw simultaneously, faster than the bank could reasonably respond. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was created initially to help finance a war against France, but it gradually took on the role of a lender of last resort, an institution that could step in and lend money to struggling banks during a panic, preventing a localized problem from cascading through the entire financial system. The United States, notably, resisted creating a permanent central bank for much of its early history, largely due to political suspicion of concentrated financial power, following the deliberate dismantling of two earlier, more limited attempts at central banking. It was only after a series of severe banking panics, particularly the Panic of 1907, during which the private banker J.P. Morgan personally coordinated an emergency rescue of the American financial system, essentially acting as a one-man central bank because no formal one existed, that American policymakers finally concluded a permanent solution was needed. A small group met secretly on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia, to draft a plan that would eventually become the Federal Reserve System, established by Congress in 1913. This is where things begin to shift again, because with the creation of central banks came a new set of tools and a new set of temptations. Central banks could, in theory, manage the money supply deliberately, smoothing out the booms and busts that had plagued economies for centuries. But they could also, in practice, be pressured by governments to print more money to fund spending, wars, or political promises, the exact same debasement instinct that tempted Roman emperors and Chinese dynasties. Now, dressed in modern institutional clothing? This tension is precisely what led to the classical gold standard, which spread widely across major economies in the decades before 1914. Under this system, a country's currency was directly convertible into a fixed amount of gold. The appeal was straightforward. If a government wanted to issue more currency, it needed to hold more gold in reserve to back it, which placed a hard physical limit on how much money could be created. This was, in essence, an attempt to prevent the debasement problem permanently by tying the water directly to a fixed, scarce resource that could not simply be conjured into existence by decree. For a time, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the gold standard provided real, tangible stability across much of the industrialized world, and it is remembered by some economic historians as a golden age of low, predictable inflation and expanding global trade. But it also came with a significant cost, one that became painfully clear during the Great Depression of the 1930s. It removed flexibility precisely when flexibility was most needed. Countries still tied to the gold standard found themselves unable to expand their money supply to fight the collapse in economic activity, even as unemployment soared and banks failed by the thousands across entire continents. Countries that abandoned the gold standard earlier, freeing their central banks to respond with looser monetary policy, generally recovered faster than those that clung to it longest. This is one of the great, hard-won lessons of 20th century economics. Rigidity designed to prevent one kind of crisis, runaway money printing, can create serious vulnerability to an entirely different kind of crisis. One where the economy desperately needs more monetary flexibility, not less. After the devastation of the Second World War, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered in the small resort town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944 to design a new international monetary system, one intended to combine the stability of the old gold standard with enough flexibility to avoid the rigidity that had worsened the Depression. The resulting system pegged the value of major world currencies to the US dollar and pegged the dollar itself to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. For roughly 2 decades, this arrangement provided a remarkable degree of global monetary stability, underpinning the long post-war economic expansion in much of the industrialized world. But the arrangement contained a structural tension that eventually became unsustainable. The United States, as the anchor currency, needed to send dollars out into the world for the rest of the global system to have enough currency to conduct international trade and hold as reserves. But the more dollars circulated abroad, the harder it became for the United States to credibly maintain its promise to convert all of them into gold at the fixed rate, since there was simply not enough gold in Fort Knox to back every dollar that existed outside the country. By 1971, facing exactly this pressure, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold, an event now often referred to, somewhat dramatically, as the Nixon shock. This effectively ended the Bretton Woods system, and with it, the last direct link between a major world currency and a fixed physical commodity. This detail is crucial for what comes next, because the 1970s that followed are in many ways the decade that most directly shaped how modern central banks think about inflation today. Freed from the gold standard's constraint, but without a fully developed replacement framework yet in place, many Western economies experienced a punishing combination of high inflation and stagnant economic growth, a condition that came to be called stagflation, a term that did not even exist in mainstream economic vocabulary before this period, because the combination had previously been considered nearly impossible under prevailing economic theory of the time. Oil price shocks, driven by an embargo imposed by major oil-producing nations in 1973, pushed energy costs up sharply, a clear, textbook example of cost-push inflation rippling through an entire global economy. At the same time, monetary policy in several countries had, for various political and institutional reasons, allowed money supply to expand faster than the real economy was growing, adding a demand-pull element directly on top of the supply shock. The person most associated with finally breaking the back of this inflationary period is Paul Volcker, who became chairman of the United States Federal Reserve in 1979. Volcker made a decision that was, at the time, deeply unpopular and economically painful. He raised interest rates dramatically. At one point, the federal funds rate exceeded 19%, deliberately slowing the economy, causing a sharp recession and a painful rise in unemployment, specifically in order to break the cycle of rising prices and rising inflation expectations that had become deeply embedded in the American economy over the preceding decade. It worked in the sense that inflation did fall substantially over the following years, from double digits down to a more manageable, stable range. But it worked at a real human cost, one that is worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over. Recessions caused deliberately to fight inflation are not abstract statistics. They mean real people losing real jobs, real businesses closing, real hardship absorbed so that prices eventually would stabilize for everyone else. And then, starting around the late 1980s and continuing through the following decades, things began to shift again. Quietly at first, central banks around the world, having learned the hard lessons of the 1970s, began adopting a new, more transparent approach. Explicit inflation targeting, most commonly around 2% per year, first formally adopted by New Zealand's central bank in 1989 and gradually copied by dozens of other countries in the years that followed. New financial instruments and markets developed at a rapid pace. Communication itself became a primary tool of monetary policy, with central bankers speaking carefully and predictably, precisely to manage the self-fulfilling expectations we discussed earlier. The world we live in now, the one where a single press conference from a central bank chair can move markets around the globe, where monthly inflation figures are reported with the kind of attention once reserved for election results, was born in this period out of the hard, expensive lessons of everything that came before it. Let us bring together everything we have gathered so far, the mechanism from earlier, and the history we have just walked through, because this is the point where they finally lock together into something you can actually use to make sense of the news. Why do central banks target roughly 2% inflation rather than 0? This is one of the questions people ask most often, and it has a genuinely satisfying answer once you understand the history behind it. A target of exactly 0 sounds intuitively like the correct answer. Stable prices, nothing rising, nothing falling. But the 1930s taught economists something uncomfortable. Economies occasionally need interest rates to go quite low, even close to 0 or below, in real terms, to respond to a serious downturn. If inflation is already sitting at 0, and an economy needs stimulus, a central bank quickly runs into a lower limit. Interest rates cannot easily go far below 0, since people would simply withdraw cash rather than accept a negative return on their savings held at a bank. A small, steady, positive inflation target of around 2% gives central banks a buffer, room to cut interest rates further, during a downturn before hitting that floor. It also acts as a buffer against deflation, a falling general price level, which, as we will discuss shortly, carries its own serious dangers, arguably more dangerous in practice than mild, steady inflation. This is why central banks are not simply trying to eliminate inflation entirely. They are trying to keep it low, stable, and predictable, which is a related but genuinely different goal. Before we go further into the modern toolkit, it is worth finally unpacking something we mentioned earlier only in passing: fractional reserve banking, because it explains where most of the money in a modern economy actually comes from, and the answer surprises most people the first time they hear it clearly stated. When you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not simply lock that money in a vault, waiting for you to return. It keeps only a fraction of it available as a reserve and lends the rest out to other customers as mortgages, business loans, and personal credit. Here is the part that tends to be genuinely surprising. When that loan is made, a new deposit is effectively created in the borrower's account. That borrower spends the money. It is deposited into another account at another bank, and that bank in turn keeps only a fraction as reserve and lends out the rest again. Each cycle of this process creates additional money in the system on top of the original deposit through a mechanism economists call the money multiplier. This is, quite literally, how most of the money supply in a modern economy is created, not primarily by a central bank running a printing press, as the popular image often suggests, but by the ordinary, everyday act of commercial banks making loans. Central banks influence this process indirectly, largely through the interest rate we described earlier, and through requirements about how much reserve banks must hold. But the actual bulk of new money creation happens continuously in the background every time an ordinary loan is issued. This mechanism connects directly to something economists call the quantity theory of money, one of the oldest and most durable ideas in the entire discipline. First articulated in something close to its modern form by the philosopher and economist David Hume in the 18th century. The theory can be expressed as a deceptively simple relationship. The total money supply multiplied by how quickly that money changes hands, a figure called velocity, equals the general price level multiplied by the total quantity of real goods and services produced. Stated plainly, this simply formalizes the bathtub we described earlier. More money, moving faster, chasing the same output, produces higher prices, almost as a matter of arithmetic. The genuine complexity, and the reason economists still debate the details centuries after Hume, lies in that velocity term. How quickly money moves through an economy is not fixed, and it can itself shift dramatically during a crisis of confidence, as we saw in Weimar Germany, where accelerating velocity became almost as important a driver of hyperinflation as the printing of new currency itself. Deflation deserves a proper explanation here, because it is often assumed to be the simple, desirable opposite of inflation. Prices falling, money becoming more valuable, surely a good thing. But economists generally regard deflation as more dangerous than mild inflation for a specific, well-documented reason. If prices are expected to keep falling, consumers and businesses have an incentive to delay purchases, waiting for goods to become even cheaper tomorrow. This delayed spending reduces demand throughout the economy, which can cause businesses to cut production and lay off workers, which reduces incomes further, which reduces spending further still. In a downward spiral that can be extraordinarily difficult to escape. Japan experienced a prolonged period of very low inflation and outright deflation across much of the 1990s and 2000s, often referred to as the lost decades, during which economic growth remained sluggish despite extremely low interest rates and repeated attempts at stimulus, illustrating just how stubborn a deflationary spiral can be once genuinely entrenched in an economy's expectations. This brings us to the modern toolkit central banks actually use, not as a recommendation for what should be done in any given situation, but simply as an explanation of what the tools are and how they function mechanically. The most visible tool, as we discussed, is the short-term interest rate, the brakes on the car. Raising this rate makes borrowing more expensive across the entire economy, cooling spending and, with a lag, cooling inflation. Lowering it does the reverse, encouraging borrowing and spending to accelerate. A second, less intuitive tool is what is often called quantitative easing, a term that entered common usage during and after the 2008 global financial crisis. In simple terms, this involves a central bank creating new bank reserves, essentially new money in electronic form, and using it to purchase financial assets, typically government bonds, from banks and other financial institutions. The intention is to inject liquidity directly into the financial system, lowering longer-term borrowing costs and encouraging lending and investment, particularly in situations where simply lowering the short-term interest rate to zero is not, by itself, providing enough stimulus to the economy. This is, in a very real sense, directly adding water to the bathtub, which is precisely why quantitative easing carries its own inflationary risk if used too aggressively or maintained for too long after it is genuinely needed, a debate that continues actively among economists today without full agreement. A third, quieter tool is forward guidance, essentially communication itself, used deliberately as policy. Central banks now routinely signal, well in advance, how they expect to adjust policy in the coming months, precisely because managing expectations, as we discussed earlier, is itself a powerful lever, capable of shaping behavior before any actual rate change even takes effect. If businesses and workers believe inflation will remain low and stable, they tend to behave in ways, moderate wage demands, moderate price increases, that help make that belief come true, almost regardless of the precise underlying economic data. Some central banks have, in more unusual circumstances, gone further still, experimenting with negative interest rates, where banks are effectively charged, rather than paid, for holding reserves with the central bank in an attempt to push them to lend more actively, rather than sit on cash. The European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan both experimented with negative rate policies in the years following the 2008 crisis, a genuinely novel and, at the time, somewhat controversial approach, illustrating just how far central banks have been willing to extend their toolkit in pursuit of managing the same ancient balance between money and goods. There is genuine ongoing debate among economists about several aspects of this picture, and it is worth being honest about where the uncertainty actually lies, rather than pretending economics is more settled than it truly is. One long-running debate concerns something called the Phillips curve, a historical observation first documented by economist William Phillips in 1958, suggesting an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. As unemployment falls, inflation tends to rise, and vice versa, because a tighter labor market gives workers more bargaining power to demand higher wages, which businesses then pass along as higher prices. This relationship held reasonably well for a number of decades, but it has weakened and become noticeably less predictable in more recent economic history, for reasons economists still actively debate, possibly related to globalization giving businesses access to lower-cost labor in other countries, possibly related to changes in how strongly workers In aggregate, currently expect and demand wage increases tied directly to inflation, possibly related to structural shifts in how modern economies are organized around services rather than manufacturing. There is no single, universally agreed answer, and reasonable, well-informed economists genuinely disagree about the current strength of this relationship. Another area of active discussion concerns supply shocks, disruptions to the actual physical flow of goods, materials, and components through an economy, separate entirely from anything happening with the money supply itself. The global disruptions to shipping, manufacturing, and energy markets that occurred in the early 2020s illustrated this vividly. Prices for many goods rose sharply, not primarily because central banks had suddenly expanded the money supply, but because the actual physical capacity to produce and transport goods was, temporarily, seriously constrained, while demand for those goods had not fallen at all, and in some categories had actually risen. This is cost-push inflation, operating at a genuinely global scale. And it illustrated something important. Not every episode of rising prices has the same underlying cause, and the appropriate response to demand-driven inflation is not necessarily the appropriate response to supply-driven inflation, even though both show up on the surface as the same rising numbers at the checkout counter. This particular episode is worth dwelling on a little longer because it combines several of the mechanisms we have already described, layered on top of one another in a way that made the underlying picture genuinely difficult to untangle in real time, even for professional economists watching it unfold. Factories in several countries slowed or paused production for a period, disrupting the supply of components used across an enormous range of industries. Shipping networks, built for a very specific, steady rhythm of global trade, found themselves suddenly mismatched with a changed pattern of demand, leading to a shortage of available shipping containers in some regions and a surplus in others, driving freight costs to levels rarely seen before. At the same time, many governments around the world worried about the economic damage caused by the disruption itself, provided substantial direct financial support to households and businesses, which helped prevent a much deeper economic collapse, but which also meant that overall spending power in the economy did not fall nearly as much as the disrupted supply of goods did. In our bathtub terms, the tub had genuinely shrunk, at least temporarily, in certain specific areas, while the water level, thanks to this support, had not fallen to match it, and in some categories had risen further still. The result was a genuinely unusual combination of demand-side and supply-side pressure arriving at the same time, which is part of why this particular period generated such extensive debate among economists about which single explanation, if any, deserved the most weight, and why, honestly, no single explanation fully captured everything that was happening across every country and every category of goods simultaneously. There is also an international dimension worth understanding, since it explains why inflation in one country is never entirely separate from what is happening in others. Exchange rates, the price of one currency in terms of another, influence inflation directly through a channel sometimes called imported inflation. If a country's currency weakens relative to its trading partners, imported goods, priced originally in a foreign currency, become more expensive in domestic terms, even if nothing at all has changed about the underlying production cost or the domestic money supply. This is one reason central banks, even those focused primarily on domestic price stability, watch exchange rates closely. And it is one reason inflation in a highly globalized, interconnected economy can never be fully understood by looking only within a single country's own borders, however carefully that single country manages its own money supply and interest rates. There is also an intriguing, more recent line of research examining whether the rise of online shopping and digital price comparison has changed the underlying dynamics of inflation itself. By making it dramatically easier for consumers to compare prices across many sellers simultaneously, which in theory should make it harder for any individual business to raise prices without losing customers to a cheaper competitor just a few clicks away. Some economists have suggested this increased price transparency may have contributed to a broader, longer-term moderation in inflation across many developed economies in the decades before the disruptions of the early 2020s, though this remains, like several of the debates we have already discussed tonight, a genuinely open question rather than a settled conclusion, actively studied rather than definitively resolved. There is also a related, more recent debate, sometimes discussed under the informal term greedflation, about whether businesses in certain industries used a period of genuine cost pressure as cover to expand their profit margins beyond what rising costs alone would strictly require. Economists studying this question have reached varied conclusions depending on the industry and country examined, and it remains an area of active empirical research, rather than settled consensus. It is worth holding this question with the same honesty we have tried to bring to everything else tonight. The answer likely differs by sector, by country, and by the specific competitive conditions in each market, rather than having one single universal explanation. Much of this modern picture was shaped by a running intellectual debate between two broad schools of thought that dominated economics through much of the 20th century. One school, associated closely with the economist Milton Friedman, and often called monetarism, held that inflation is, in his own frequently repeated words, always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, meaning the changes in the money supply are, in essentially every meaningful case, the true underlying driver of inflation over any sustained period, and that other factors, however visible in the short term, are secondary. The opposing tradition, rooted in the earlier work of John Maynard Keynes, placed greater emphasis on the role of overall demand in the economy, on the psychology of expectations, and on the idea that prices and wages do not always adjust smoothly or quickly, meaning that simple direct control of the money supply alone might not fully explain or fully control the behavior of prices in the real world. Modern central banking, as it is actually practiced today, tends to draw from both traditions rather than adhering strictly to either. Taking monetarism's emphasis on the fundamental importance of money supply, while incorporating Keynesian insights about demand, expectations, and the reality that economies do not always adjust as cleanly or quickly as the simplest models might suggest. This blended, pragmatic approach is itself a reflection of the honesty we have tried to bring to this entire evening. Neither school, on its own, fully captured the picture, and the current synthesis, however useful, is still very much a work in progress rather than a finished, settled theory. There is also a quieter, more philosophical debate worth acknowledging honestly. How much of inflation at any given moment is genuinely about the mechanics we have described, and how much is about the stories we tell each other about it? Expectations, as we discussed, are not simply a side effect of inflation. They are, in a meaningful sense, part of what causes it. This means that inflation sits in an unusual, slightly uncomfortable space in economics. It is a real, measurable, physical phenomenon, rooted in the genuine relationship between money supply and productive capacity. And it is also, simultaneously, a kind of collective psychological event, shaped by what millions of individual people believe will happen next. Economists have not fully resolved how to weigh these two aspects against each other, and it is honest to say that we still do not fully understand this relationship with the precision we might like, even after a century of careful, dedicated study. It is worth noting, finally, that the very act of measuring inflation accurately is itself a genuinely difficult, ongoing technical challenge, one that statistical agencies continually refine. The basket of goods used to calculate official inflation figures is periodically updated to reflect changing consumption patterns. New categories of spending are added as they become significant. Older ones are reduced in weight as they become less common, and adjustments are made for changes in the quality of goods over time. Since a smartphone or a car today typically offers considerably more capability than one sold a decade earlier at a similar nominal price, a factor economists call quality adjustment, which attempts to separate a price increase reflecting genuine improvement in a product from a price increase reflecting pure inflation. This technical complexity is rarely discussed outside professional circles, but it is worth knowing that the number reported each month is the product of a careful, continuously refined methodology, attempting to capture something genuinely difficult to pin down with perfect precision: the changing cost, over time, of maintaining a broadly similar standard of living. It is worth knowing, too, that not every central bank pursues this goal in exactly the same way, or with exactly the same mandate, which explains some of the differences you may notice when comparing news coverage from different countries. The United States Federal Reserve operates under what is often called a dual mandate, legally required to pursue both stable prices and maximum sustainable employment simultaneously, treating the two goals as equally important, even though they can, at times, pull policy in different directions. The European Central Bank, by contrast, operates under a mandate that places price stability as its clearly primary objective, with other economic considerations treated as secondary. A design choice shaped in part by the historical memory across several European countries of the devastating hyperinflations of the 20th century, and a resulting institutional preference for erring strongly on the side of caution against inflation, even at some cost to other economic goals. Neither approach is simply correct in an objective sense. Each reflects a different set of historical experiences, political values, and institutional priorities, translated into the specific legal mandate that governs how that particular central bank behaves. One further development from this period deserves mention because it explains a detail you may have noticed without quite registering why it exists: the deliberate independence of central banks from direct political control. In the decades following the 1970s, a growing body of economic research and a growing body of painful practical experience converged on a similar conclusion. Governments facing elections have a structural temptation to prioritize short-term economic stimulus, lower interest rates, looser policy, even when doing so risks higher inflation later because the benefits of stimulus arrive quickly before votes are cast, while the costs of inflation tend to arrive slowly, often after the next election has already passed. To remove this temptation, many countries restructured their central banks to operate with significant independence from elected government, insulated from short-term political pressure, even while remaining accountable to the public through mandates set by legislatures and regular public reporting. This is one of the more quietly significant institutional innovations of the late 20th century, and it reflects a specific, hard-learned lesson. Managing the balance between money and goods works better when it is protected from the shorter time horizons that democratic politics naturally tends to favor. There is also a body of theory associated particularly with the economist Robert Lucas sometimes called rational expectations theory, which adds a further layer of subtlety to everything we have described about expectations shaping outcomes. The theory suggests that people and businesses do not simply react passively to past inflation, adjusting their behavior only after prices have already moved. Instead, they actively anticipate future policy, incorporating their best guess about what a central bank is likely to do into their decisions today. One striking implication of this idea is that a policy change that is fully and credibly anticipated in advance may have a different, sometimes smaller, effect than the same policy would have if it arrived as a surprise, because markets and individuals have already in effect priced in the expected change before it formally happens. This is part of why central bank communication has become such a central, carefully managed part of modern monetary policy, not simply as a courtesy to the public, but as an actual tool. Since managing what people rationally expect is, according to this theory, nearly as important as the policy action itself. So what does all of this mean for us? Not for governments and central banks sitting in their meeting rooms and press conferences, but for the quiet daily life that most of us are actually living. Lying here, in the dark, thinking about a grocery bill or a rent payment, rather than a monetary policy committee meeting? So, what do we do with all of this? Let us start by dismantling a few myths, gently, now that we have the full picture in front of us. The first myth is that inflation is caused primarily by greed, that prices rise mainly because businesses decide, out of simple avarice, to charge more than they need to. Businesses do respond to conditions, and in periods of genuine cost pressure or strong demand, some absolutely do raise prices more than their costs alone would strictly require, as the debate we just discussed illustrates. But framing inflation primarily as a morality story, good actors versus bad actors, misses almost everything we have just spent an hour understanding. The deep, structural relationship between money supply, productive capacity, historical institutional design, and collective expectation. It is not that greed does not exist anywhere, ever. It is that greed, on its own, cannot explain why inflation rises and falls in the broad, sweeping historical patterns we trace tonight across entirely different economic and political systems, across many centuries, long before modern corporations existed in anything like their current form. The second myth is that inflation is something entirely outside human influence, an unpredictable force of nature, like weather arriving unannounced. This is also not quite right, and in a way, it is the opposite error from the first myth. Inflation is deeply human-made, the product of specific institutional choices, historical decisions about how money supply is managed, and specific traceable events, from the debasement of Roman coins to the printing presses of Weimar Germany, to the Nixon shock, to the deliberate, painful decisions Paul Volcker made in 1979. It is not random. It follows patterns, shaped by real decisions, made by real people, in real rooms across history, and those decisions can be understood, studied, and, to some meaningful extent, anticipated. The third myth, and perhaps the one worth sitting with longest, is the fear that inflation means the system is fundamentally rigged against ordinary people, that someone, somewhere, is quietly benefiting from your money losing value while you can do nothing about it. There is a kernel of truth buried inside this fear, worth acknowledging honestly. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. People holding large amounts of cash with no other assets are affected differently than people holding assets whose value tends to move with, or even ahead of, inflation over time. This asymmetry is real, and it is one of the genuine structural reasons inflation generates such a strong emotional response. It can quietly redistribute value in ways that are not announced, voted on, or immediately visible. Unlike a tax increase, which is at least transparent and openly debated, but this is different from the system being deliberately rigged as a matter of conscious intent, aimed at any particular person. It is, instead, an emergent property of how money and value work, the same emergent property that has appeared, in one form or another, in essentially every economy that has ever used money, from ancient Rome to Song Dynasty China to modern financial markets today. Understanding that this is a structural pattern, rather than a personal targeting, tends to shift the emotional weight of it considerably, even though it does not change the underlying reality of the numbers themselves. Let us address the specific fears directly and gently, because they deserve to be named rather than talked around or minimized. There is the fear that your savings are quietly eroding, and this fear is grounded in something real. Money sitting still, doing nothing, does lose purchasing power during periods of sustained inflation, exactly as the bathtub analogy would predict. There is the fear that the system feels rigged, which we have just addressed as a structural pattern rather than a conspiracy, though the emotional weight of that pattern is entirely legitimate to feel, regardless of the technical explanation underneath it. There is the fear, familiar to anyone who has watched wages seem to lag behind prices, that hard work no longer buys what it once did, which touches on real, documented, and actively studied questions about how wage growth and productivity growth have moved relative to one another across different periods and different countries. A genuinely complex question that honest economists continue to research, rather than one with a single, tidy answer. And there is the fear that there is nothing an ordinary person can do, faced with forces this large, this historical, this structural. This last fear is, in a strange way, the one most worth reframing tonight, not because it is entirely wrong, but because nothing to do and nothing to understand are two very different things, and we have just spent this evening closing that second gap, even if the first one remains, for good reason, genuinely open. It is worth pausing, too, on a quieter observation that emerges once you have walked through the full sweep of this history. Almost none of the people at the center of these stories were acting with malice. John Law genuinely believed his scheme would solve France's fiscal crisis, and for a while, it appeared to be working exactly as he hoped. The officials who allowed Weimar Germany's printing presses to run were, in most accounts, attempting to meet impossible reparations demands with the tools available to them, not deliberately engineering a collapse. Paul Volcker knew with complete clarity that his decision would cause real, immediate, painful unemployment, and made it anyway because he judged the alternative, a decade or more of entrenched, spiraling inflation, to be worse. This does not mean every historical decision around money has been wise, or that every actor deserves sympathy. It means that the story of inflation is, overwhelmingly, a story of people working with incomplete information under real constraints, making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, sometimes turning out to be right, sometimes turning out to be catastrophically wrong, and only visible as one or the other, with the benefit of hindsight that none of them actually had while the decision was being made. There is a kind of quiet comfort available in that observation, if you are willing to sit with it. The anxiety inflation produces often comes from a sense that someone, somewhere, must be responsible, must have intended this, must be making a deliberate choice at your specific expense. What the history actually shows, again and again, across 3,000 years and dozens of different currencies and civilizations, is something closer to a very large, very old, very human puzzle. One that each generation inherits, works on with the tools and knowledge available to it, sometimes solves partially, and passes forward, slightly improved, to the next. You are not standing outside this story watching it happen to you. You are, whether you think about it often or not, one small part of the same very long puzzle that the Medici clerks and the Roman mint officials and the delegates at Bretton Woods and Paul Volcker were all working on too, each in their own time, with their own limited view of what would come next. There is a fourth myth worth naming, one that tends to surface especially around retirement or around watching parents or grandparents navigate their later years, the fear that inflation makes long-term saving pointless, that any amount set aside today will simply be eaten away by the time it is needed. This fear, again, contains something real inside it. Money held purely in cash over long periods does lose meaningful purchasing power. And this is precisely why financial systems have developed a whole range of instruments specifically designed to grow in value over time at rates that can, depending on conditions, outpace inflation. Even if none of them can guarantee it with certainty, the existence of inflation does not make saving pointless. It makes the specific form the saving takes meaningfully important, which is a very different, more manageable problem than the one the fear initially presents. There is a fifth fear worth addressing directly, because it surfaces so often in exactly this kind of quiet, late-night worry, the sense that inflation is somehow a sign of personal failure, that if only you had made different choices, different decisions, you would not feel its effects so acutely. This fear deserves to be gently but firmly set down. Inflation is a macroeconomic phenomenon, operating at the scale of an entire currency, an entire economy, sometimes an entire interconnected global system. It is not a referendum on your individual choices, your career, your budgeting, or your worth. The same forces that shaped the price revolution in 16th century Europe, or the Weimar hyperinflation, or the stagflation Paul Volcker fought in 1979, are still, in modified form, the forces at work today, vast, structural, historical, and entirely impersonal in their origin, even though their effects land, unavoidably, on individual households and individual lives. It is also worth pausing on something we touched on earlier, but did not fully sit with: the question of who is affected most and why, because this is where a great deal of the genuine, legitimate frustration around inflation actually comes from. Inflation tends to weigh more heavily on households with less flexibility, those living paycheck to paycheck, with little in savings to buffer against rising costs and little bargaining power to negotiate wages upward as quickly as prices move. It tends to weigh less heavily on households holding significant assets, property, shares, businesses, whose value often moves with or ahead of the general price level. This is not a hidden conspiracy. It is a structural feature of how inflation interacts with different types of wealth. And it is precisely why inflation, even when successfully brought under control by policy, tends to leave behind lasting questions about fairness that are worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing simply because the underlying mechanism itself is well understood. There is a natural question that tends to surface right about now, lying here, having walked through 3,000 years of coins, ledgers, bubbles, and committees. If all of this is so structural, so historical, so far beyond any single person's control, what was the point of understanding it at all? The answer is quieter than you might expect, but no less real for being quiet. Understanding does not hand you control over the economy. It hands you something more modest, and in its own way, more valuable. The ability to tell the difference between a genuine threat and a familiar pattern, between something that requires urgent personal action and something that simply requires patience, while institutions, however imperfectly, do the slow work of correction they have always eventually done. That distinction, small as it sounds, is often the entire difference between a low, persistent hum of anxiety running underneath your days and a calm, informed awareness that sits quietly in the background, checked in on occasionally, but no longer occupying the space it once did. So what do we do with all of this? In practical terms, the answer, and this might be the least satisfying part of everything we have explored tonight, is that there is no single answer. The economy is not a machine you can tune with a screwdriver. It is billions of people making decisions every day, and the patterns that emerge are real, but not fully controllable by any single person, institution, or government. What we have done tonight is not give you a strategy. It is give you the words, the framework, the understanding you need to make sense of the headlines, to ask better questions, and to sit with uncertainty without it turning into fear. For the rest, the decisions about what to do with your own resources, that is between you and your own judgment, ideally informed by professionals who understand your specific situation. What we have done tonight is give you something quieter, but maybe more lasting, the ability to see the system clearly. And sometimes that is enough. Here is why this affects us, in the end, more calmly than it might have felt an hour ago. Inflation is not a punishment aimed at you personally. It is not proof that the world is unmanageable or that money itself is a lie. It is a pattern, an old, recurring, deeply human pattern, traceable across coins debased in ancient Rome, paper notes issued against imaginary Mississippi prophets, gold standards abandoned during depressions, and interest rates raised past 19% to break a decade of spiraling prices. Every generation that has ever used money has, in some form, lived through some version of this same story. And every generation has found, eventually, some form of stability on the other side of it. Not because the underlying problem was permanently solved once and for all, but because the pattern, once understood, becomes something you can live alongside, rather than something that simply happens to you without explanation. There is one final reframe worth sitting with before we let this beat rest. So much of the anxiety around inflation comes from treating it as a single, isolated event. This year's number, this month's headline, this particular receipt. But everything we have walked through tonight suggests a different way of holding it as one recurring chapter in a much longer, ongoing story. One that has included periods of painful excess and periods of hard-won stability, often within the same country, sometimes within the same decade. The Rentenmark followed Weimar. Volcker's recession followed the stagflation of the 1970s. Explicit inflation targeting followed the lessons both of those painful episodes taught. The pattern is not simply inflation happens. The fuller, more accurate pattern is inflation happens is eventually understood and is eventually met with some form of correction, even when that correction takes years, or in some historical cases, decades, to fully arrive. This does not promise that the correction will always come quickly, or painlessly, or exactly when you might wish it would. But it does mean that the current moment, whatever it happens to look like for you right now, is very unlikely to be the permanent, unchanging state of things. It is a chapter. Chapters end. What most accounts leave out when discussing inflation on the evening news is precisely this longer view, the sense that we are not living through something unprecedented, something uniquely broken about our particular moment in history, but rather a specific instance of a pattern human beings have navigated, with varying degrees of success and failure, for roughly 3,000 years, ever since the first shell was traded for the first fish. And suddenly, it all makes sense. Not in the sense that every headline will become simple or comforting, but in the sense that the underlying shape of the thing is no longer a total mystery. Prices rise. Money is a claim on real things. Claims can multiply faster than the real things they represent. Institutions exist, imperfectly, to manage that balance. And history again and again shows us both the mistakes and the corrections that followed them. That is the whole of it. Not a mystery, a pattern. You are lying there now, in the dark, perhaps thinking faintly of a receipt from earlier today or a number on a screen that seemed a little higher than it used to be. The prices are still what they are. The system is still doing what it does. But now you know why. There is a strange peace in that, in seeing the pattern, even when the pattern is not something you can personally change from where you are lying right now. Think for a moment of that bathtub, water and tub, money and goods. Somewhere, right now, in a quiet office you will never see, someone is watching that balance, adjusting a lever a fraction of a degree, hoping the effect lands 18 months from now in a way that feels, to you, like nothing at all. That is what success looks like in this particular part of the economy. Not excitement, quiet, stability so complete it becomes invisible, the way a good bridge is, one you never think about while crossing it. Think of the shells traded on a beach somewhere, thousands of years before ledgers or coins existed, two people agreeing, without any government, any bank, any decree, that this small, pretty object could stand in for a fish, or a length of rope, or a favor owed. That agreement, quiet, unwritten, entirely voluntary, is still, underneath every modern complexity we walk through tonight, the same agreement holding up the number in your own bank account. Right now, nothing about money has ever really changed at its foundation. Only the shape of the agreement has grown more elaborate, more layered, more distant from the two people standing on that beach. But the trust underneath it is the same trust. It always has been. Think of the Medici clerks centuries ago, writing careful entries into a ledger by candlelight, inventing, almost by accident, a system of trust that would eventually become the invisible architecture behind every card you have ever tapped against a machine. Think of a French crowd, centuries after that, watching paper notes lose their meaning in a single season, and a nation learning the hard way what happens when belief outruns reality. Think of a central banker in 1979, watching unemployment rise on purpose, trading one kind of pain for the end of another, deciding that the harder, shorter road was the one worth taking. None of them knew at the time that their small, specific, deeply human decisions would still be shaping a conversation happening in a dark, quiet room centuries and decades later, as someone drifts slowly toward sleep. The economy is not a natural disaster happening to you. It is a human creation shaped by human choices, made across centuries by people solving the problems directly in front of them with the tools they happen to have. And we are inside it, all of us, together, still solving it, still adjusting it, still occasionally getting it wrong, and slowly, imperfectly, correcting course. The rent will still be due, the number on the receipt will still be what it is. But somewhere underneath the worry, there is now a shape to hold on to, a pattern, a story with real people in it, stretching back further than you might have imagined an hour ago, and continuing forward, quietly long after tonight, long after this particular receipt is forgotten entirely. Somewhere, centuries from now, someone else will be lying in a dark room of their own, thinking about their own version of this same worry, wrapped in whatever new shape money has taken by then. And somewhere in the quiet architecture underneath their worry, this same pattern will still be there, waiting to be understood, the way it was waiting for you tonight, and the way it was waiting for a Roman merchant weighing a coin in his palm, wondering, just as you have wondered, why it seemed to buy a little less than it used to. Somewhere, a young economist, not yet born when Volcker made his decision in 1979, is studying that same episode tonight in a library, trying to understand it well enough to help write the next chapter of this very old story. Somewhere, a currency you have never heard of is quietly gaining or losing value against another, watched closely by people whose job it is to notice, so that you never have to. And as you lie there, the world continues to turn. Transactions settle. Ledgers balance somewhere in systems descended from candlelit rooms in Florence. Somewhere, a committee is reviewing numbers that will not be announced for weeks. Somewhere, a shopkeeper adjusts a label by a fraction. Without quite noticing, they are doing it. And here, in the dark, none of it needs your attention. It simply is, as it always has been, as it will be tomorrow.